Welcome to Module 3A, Defining, Identifying, and Measuring Outputs. This module will cover defining, identifying, promising and best practices, defining and identifying outputs, and measuring outputs. This module goes with the evaluation section of the proposal, where you're asked to describe the expected outputs and outcomes of the project, and how successful completion of the project will impact people with IDD and/or systems serving people with IDD. It may be helpful to print or open the evaluation module worksheet and fill it out as we go through the slides. You can stop the presentation and fill out each section of the worksheet as it relates to your project. In this video, we are going to focus on section A of the worksheet, which identifies outputs. Now let's think about the practice you are using. This is important because the practice will determine your outputs and outcomes. More about deciding on your practice can be found in the Methods module, Module 2. Hopefully, that section helped you decide if you're using a promising or best practice. You also need to decide if you're creating a new practice or aiming to improve or support a practice that is already available. This is a picture of the evaluation module worksheet, section A1. Number 1 on the worksheet guides you through deciding your practice outputs. Here is an example for an application that is applying to create a firefighter awareness program about how to support people with IDD in the community called Fire Up. In response to the question, are you applying to create or improve/support a promising practice, we said yes. Then we specified the practice, which is Fire Up. The next line asks us to decide if we are creating or improving, supporting the practice. We checked Create, since the application aims to create a new Fire Up program. An output is any tangible product from your project, also a participant or system change. The first output is whatever you do to create or support your practice. If your project involves people participating in a program, your output would be the number of people participating. For example, the number of people with IDD participating, the number of family members of people with IDD, or the number of people who are learning to deliver a practice. You will also want to list any of your collaborators as outputs. If your project involves developing products, such as a manual or a toolkit, or creating a training, these would also be outputs. If you are developing a policy for your agency or your region, that is a systems output. Your project may have several outputs. Let's move on to section A2 on the worksheet. This focuses on identifying participant outputs. The SCDD performance measures look at two kinds of participants. The first are people. These could be people with disabilities or their family members participating in an activity. For example, if your program involves an advocacy skill building program, teaching children with developmental disabilities to participate in their individual education program, or IEP, the children are your participants, and so are their family members if they are helping. Participants could also be other people who are being trained or educated, such as first responders or program staff. Think about how many people you expect to participate and if there are other things that you think are important about who can participate. For example, do you expect adults or children to participate? Are you training people with a specific role, such as firefighters or teachers? The second kind of participant that the SCDD performance measures look at are collaborators. It's highly likely that your project has collaborative partners. These could be organizations that have staff or clients participating in activities or trainings, organizations that contribute towards funding or other resources, or even organizations that will promote your program. Try to think broadly and identify as many collaborators as you can. For example, if you're training safety personnel in how to support people with developmental disabilities, one output would be the safety personnel trained, another would be the number of people with developmental disabilities they work with, and another would be the safety agencies you collaborate with. They are the ones who send the personnel to the training. Okay, now we're looking at section A3 on the worksheet. The next type of output are systems outputs. Are you trying to change any systems or rules? This might be for your state or region or for your agency. The SCDD performance measures look at two types of system outputs. The first category is related to policies and procedures. Policies are standardized agency rules. Procedures are practices of agencies or agency personnel during work. If you're attempting to create or change the way things work within your agency, you would have a systems output related to policies and procedures. Some examples include changing the way you train your staff to teach parents about IEP participation, or changing the way firefighters are trained to work with people with IDD. The second category of systems outputs involves statutes and regulations. Statutes refer to laws and other enactments that are made by government and are formally documented. Regulations are rules or administrative codes that are formally documented and used by governmental agencies. If you're hoping to change how things work at the legal or governmental level, then you have outputs related to statutes and regulations. Some examples include changing the type of training requirements needed to become a firefighter to include IDD training, or changing the law about the caseload for job coaches. When you're writing about these outputs, be sure to specify the item that you are targeting and what that means for people with IDD. We are moving into section A4 of the worksheet, which looks at outputs that are not specifically identified by the SCDD performance measures. You might have several outputs that are important to your project that do not align with their list. Think about the practice you are using. Will you have anything to report that is something people can see, read, or do? Think about anything you will make that is not a person or participant. Will you develop instructions on how to use a practice? Will you develop trainings? How many trainings will you have and how often? In describing these outputs, be as specific and descriptive as possible about what products you will be creating and who will have access to them. Now let's think about how to measure outputs. The measurements you choose will depend on your program, staff, and other resources. For example, how will you show that you created or adapted a promising or best practice? You could create videos describing how to do training or create a training manual. How could you show that you are supporting a promising or best practice? If you do a training, you could report the number of training sessions completed. Here are some examples. How could you count the number of people affected by your program? If you are doing trainings, you could have a sign-in sheet for training sessions. If you're training students to participate in their IEP meetings, you could have IEP team members complete surveys on the attendance of trained students. You can also think about people who are affected by your program but who are not participants. For example, if you count the number of people with IDD and their families that firefighters help after the Fire Up training, that is an output. Now let's think about measuring systems change. One example for policy change related to student IEP participation would be to survey participating special education teachers and ask them if they are inviting students to IEPs since their school made this a policy. Or perhaps the goal is to use Fire Up each year to train new firefighters. Then you could measure the number of fire agencies that provide that training each year. Review your outputs on the worksheet. Go ahead and fill in a list of your project's outputs in the table in number A5. Then think about how you'll measure your outputs. Try to think about simple ways to measure the people and products affected by your practice. The clearer, the better. The example table here has two vertical columns, labeled from left to right as output and measurement. We'll fill out the table using our Fire Up example. The first row describes one example output. Under the output column, we've written creating a promising practice called Fire Up. On the same row under measurement, we've written create a Fire Up manual. That's how we'll know we created our practice. The second row under output says Fire Up participants, and under measurement says sign-in sheet at Fire Up sessions, as this is one way we could measure how many people participate. Great! Now you have a basic idea of what promising practices, best practices, and outputs you'll be using, as well as how you'll be measuring them. You can use this worksheet as a guide as you write this section of your proposal. In the next module, we'll move on to how to develop your goals and measure your outcomes.